What if your kitchen knife or a baker's loaf of bread were punished for committing a crime? In medieval Europe, inanimate objects were treated as moral agents in their own right. Swords were exiled for murder, and bells rang themselves into legal trouble during storms. But why create trials for things that can't listen or learn? These cases might seem strange to us, but they reveal a belief system where every element of life was part of a grand moral order. Stay tuned to uncover the logic behind the laws of the unliving. In 1386, in the small town of Falaise, France, a very unusual trial took place. The accused was led into the courtroom, her hairless pink skin dressed in a jacket, gloves and breeches, as if she were a noble. She was not, in fact, human at all. She was a pig. Why? This particular pig had been charged with a heinous crime, killing and mauling a child to death. And in medieval Europe, crime could not be ignored, no matter the offender. This wasn't some show trial for entertainment either. The proceedings were taken seriously, with a judge, clerks, witnesses, and yes, even legal representation for the unfortunate swine. Imagine the scene. Officials solemnly gathered as they debated the guilt of an animal that couldn't possibly understand the weight of the accusations. The pig's lawyer argued on her behalf, though predictably he didn't have much to go on. The evidence was damning. Witnesses testified to her crime, confirming that she had attacked the young child. The court hoped the clothing, crafted to mimic human dress, wasn't simply a cruel joke, but an attempt to underline that the pig was being treated with the same measure of accountability as any person in the eyes of the law. At first glance, it's easy to brush this off as ridiculous, but there's a deeper logic here. In medieval thought, animals weren't just dumb creatures serving human needs. They were part of God's creation, bound by a cosmic moral order, much like humans. When an animal committed a crime, it wasn't just seen as an accident or instinct. It was an affront to divine law, something that would disrupt moral balance. Holding this pig accountable wasn't an act of randomness. It was meant to send a message to the universe itself. Justice wasn't just a human construct, it was cosmic. And justice, no matter how strange it looks to us, had to be restored. The pig was naturally found guilty and sentenced to death in one of the most public displays possible. The execution was strict. She was hanged by her hind legs in the town square, a spectacle meant to draw a crowd. And that crowd wasn't there for morbid entertainment alone. This act served a critical moral function for the community. People didn't just want the wrongdoer punished, they wanted to see the balance of order visibly restored in front of them. The public nature of the punishment reminded everyone that all creatures, no matter their intelligence or status, lived under the same divine expectations. So why dress the pig in clothes? It wasn't just a grotesque detail for the history books. Clothing her like a human emphasized her moral agency, even if, we all know, the pig wasn't aware of what was happening. It symbolized the belief that all living beings were, in a sense, answerable to the universe's laws. That belief was so entrenched that pigs, cows, dogs, and even rodents found themselves facing the judgment of medieval courts. And even though they never stood a chance of understanding, the trials fulfilled an important role in maintaining the fabric of medieval society. You might question, though, what was stopping anyone from rejecting the whole idea? Wouldn't some villagers push back and say, "It's just a pig, what's the point?" Not in this context. Rejecting the pig's trial wasn't just rejecting the punishment of a rough beast. It was rejecting an entire worldview. And that worldview was a key way medieval people made sense of life's chaos. Remember, this wasn't an era of forensic evidence, legal nuance or psychological analysis. Justice had less to do with figuring out the actual motives of a perpetrator and more to do with ensuring that cosmic order reigned. Whether that involved a child-killing pig or something even stranger, it had to be done. What makes this story so remarkable is how it completely shifts the way most of us understand justice. Today we'd see this as absurd. An animal isn't capable of moral thought, so it can't commit a moral crime. But in medieval Europe, the pig's actions mattered less than the principle they threatened. Letting the crime slide wasn't an option. The act had shaken moral order, and by punishing the pig, symbolically, the scales were brought back into balance. Strangely, this isn't far removed from some other long-standing practices where objects and beings are held responsible for harm, even things we'd see as merely tools or incapable agents of chaos. If you take a moment to step back, it starts making sense, at least from a medieval perspective. In their view, it wasn't just about keeping humans in check. Chaos had to be pushed back on every level, against every offender, to preserve the fragile harmony of their world. And the laws didn't stop at animals. When a pig could stand trial, what was stopping more inanimate things from meeting that same courtroom fate? Can objects, even totally lifeless ones, be held accountable for crimes? That might sound impossible, but stick around, because medieval justice didn't stop at pigs. It had legal space for swords, bells, and even acts of nature themselves. Justice didn't stop at people or animals. It extended even to your tools, your weapons, your things. Let's say you're sharpening a sword one chilly evening. It served you well, protected your home from bandits, maybe earned you some coin in a tournament. But then, that very sword ends up in the wrong hands, or maybe even your own, when something goes horribly wrong. A fight breaks out, someone is killed, and before anyone can catch their breath, the sword is snatched up as evidence. Now here's the twist. In this story, it's not the wielder being dragged into court, it's the sword. Yes, an inanimate object standing, well, lying, for trial. Picture the scene. The courtroom is full, murmurs rippling through the gathered crowd. The sword, the criminal in question, rests on a table at the centre of the hall. There's no lawyer defending it, no testimony to explain its motives, but the proceedings still hold weight. Hearings might include witnesses recalling the tragedy, pointing fingers not just at whoever swung the blade, but at the weapon itself. What's at stake isn't whether the sword wanted to do harm. Who would argue such a ridiculous thing? Instead, this is about its role in disrupting the divine equilibrium, something no object, animal or human, could dodge in medieval thinking. It sounds ridiculous, right? Surely a sword can't commit murder. It's just a weapon, a long piece of sharp metal, incapable of thought or intention. And yet, to medieval minds, it wasn't about the sword's conscious actions. They believed in a universe where every element of creation, living or not, was meant to align with God's grand moral order. When that order was broken, punishment wasn't just about holding someone responsible. It was about restoring harmony. And in cases like this, the sword itself carried the blame for bringing chaos into the world. The punishments for such objects were about as strange as the trials themselves. If a sword was found guilty, it could face banishment or even destruction. This wasn't just a private matter either. These events were public, almost ceremonious. Imagine it. The town gathers to watch as the condemned sword is taken away, perhaps hurled off a cliff or buried outside the city walls. The act of removing the weapon was a symbolic cleansing, a way to show that the community had taken steps to rid itself of the offending object. By banishing or destroying the sword, they weren't just getting rid of a tool, they were sending a clear message that no disruption, no matter how small or seemingly inert, would be allowed to fester. Take a moment to think about that. It wasn't just about punishing crime, it was about reassuring people that the collective moral structure would remain intact. In a world full of suffering, disease and war, every small act of justice, however strange, was a way to push back against the chaos that threatened to swallow their communities whole. Of course, to our modern eyes, this sort of justice feels absurd. We see crime and responsibility as human matters, decisions made by people who can think, plan, and act on their impulses. A sword is just the tool, like a hammer, a car, or even a modern firearm. But this distinction wasn't so clear-cut back then. The sword wasn't just a piece of metal, it was part of a larger moral ecosystem. If chaos erupted because of it, then it bore some of the guilt, the stain of the act it was involved in. Leaving it unpunished, unaddressed, would feel like leaving the crime itself unresolved. It wasn't just swords that faced this peculiar blend of justice either. Other inanimate objects could find themselves at the mercy of medieval courts. For instance, if a bell was believed to have caused a destructive storm by summoning divine wrath, well, you'd better believe the bell might be hauled off and punished in kind. Trees, too, were sometimes blamed for harbouring witches or other spiritual dangers, and could face the axe not just as a practical matter, but as an act of symbolic retribution. The logic was consistent, even if it sounds bizarre to us now. Any disruption of the sacred order had to be dealt with, no matter where it came from. As strange as it all seems, it's a reminder of just how different medieval ideas of justice were from our own. For them, fairness wasn't really the point. It wasn't about rational investigation or weighing evidence to assign proportional consequences. Justice was about something much bigger. It was about maintaining cosmic balance, keeping humans and everything else in their proper place. If that meant holding swords or bells or even trees accountable for their involvement in chaos, so be it. Think about how sweeping this worldview really was. Today, we put an enormous emphasis on separating animate from inanimate, people from objects. The idea of assigning agency to anything but a living creature seems at best a stretch of the imagination. But for medieval societies, the lines weren't so firmly drawn. They lived in a universe where everything, every tool, every animal, every gust of wind, was part of a complex moral structure. If we lived in that world, you might inspect your belongings a little more closely, wondering which one might someday land itself in trouble. What's fascinating is that this belief system, as strange as it seems to us now, wasn't irrational by their standards. It wasn't about the literal guilt of a sword. It was about making sure their world felt ordered and complete. Every person, every object played a role in that order, and when chaos or harm emerged, restoring balance was far more important than untangling concepts of intention or blame. That's why they didn't blink at trials like these. The sword was guilty, not because it wanted to be, but because it had been part of the disruption. Justice could only be served by holding it accountable. This approach also highlights how deeply tied justice was to the community itself. These public displays, trials, banishments, and destruction weren't just about the outcome. They were performances, ways of communicating to the villagers that their world wasn't slipping out of control. In a time when life was fragile and uncertain, seeing order restored, even symbolically, was a kind of reassurance. It reminded people that the grand moral system they trusted hadn't been shaken beyond repair. Even though we've left practices like this far behind, there's something strangely relatable in the weight they gave to symbols. Today, when a terrible crime happens, we still create performances of justice, public trials, media coverage, visible acts of punishment. These things serve a purpose beyond just punishment. They tell everyone watching, the rules still work, the order is still intact. Maybe, in some ways, we haven't left everything medieval behind after all. And just when you think the trend of holding objects accountable couldn't get stranger, there's something even more puzzling waiting. What happens when a bell, yes, a literal ringing bell, finds itself accused of creating chaos? Medieval courts didn't just stop at swords. They had room for objects caught in natural disasters, plunging the concept of justice into even murkier territory. Imagine a bell ringing out in a storm, its heavy sound swallowed by crashing thunder, its vibrations lost in sheets of rain. Now imagine someone pointing an accusing finger at that very bell, blaming it for the chaos. Strange, not if you were living in medieval Europe. Back then, when a storm tore through the heavens, it wasn't seen as random weather. Storms were thought to be divine wrath, raw punishment unleashed upon humans for their sins. And in this world, things, yes, things, could be held accountable for their role in the destruction. It wasn't unheard of for a bell to find itself on the wrong side of a trial when a storm blew through, standing accused of aiding or even summoning nature's fury. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? A bell can't summon a storm, let alone swing the scales of divine anger. But the medieval worldview didn't draw clean lines between the living and the non-living. To them, a bell wasn't just an object. It was part of the web of existence, tied up in the cosmic and the spiritual. When it tolled during a storm, a battle cry against the sky, or perhaps a desperate plea for divine mercy, it wasn't an innocent bystander. It could be seen as provoking, or even amplifying, the chaos that followed. Now, you might wonder, why go after the bell instead of just blaming the people who rang it? After all, somebody had to pull the rope, right? But that logic didn't always apply here. In the medieval mindset, a bell could take on a personality of its own, almost as if it operated with intention. Because of its size, its overwhelming sound, and its religious associations, a bell wasn't just some piece of church property. It was a powerful symbol, connected to its community, its parish, and its sacred role. If it was ringing during God's wrathful fury, it could easily be cast as a partner in crime. This wasn't just superstition for the sake of a story. There was a theological underpinning to all of it. Storms were more than weather. They were warnings, punishments, or moments of divine intervention. Crops destroyed, lives lost. That wasn't just bad luck. It was a direct response to human failure. Maybe a village hadn't prayed hard enough, or perhaps someone had committed a sin grave enough to ripple out into the skies. When a bell came into the picture during a storm, its ringing became part of the event, bound to the chaos it could not control. And once a connection formed in people's minds, justice demanded action. Take, for instance, the bizarre practice of prosecuting and punishing a bell after a devastating storm. In some cases, this meant the bell would be banished. Yes, exiled, as if it could pick up its metal skirts and march itself out of town. It might be stripped from its belfry and carted to some distant location, far away from the people it had allegedly wronged. Other times, the punishment went further. Bells could be destroyed, melted down, or disassembled as a final act of retribution. The logic was as symbolic as it was literal. Removing a guilty bell wasn't just about getting rid of the object, it was about undoing the disorder it represented. The destruction or exile of the bell was like pressing a cosmic reset button, a way to tell God, or the fractured community, that the interruption had been dealt with and balance could return. Sure, it wasn't likely to prevent the next storm, but it was a way for people to feel a sense of control in a universe that was often hostile and unpredictable. Imagine the ritual of a bell's punishment. It's not hard to see how these events might have unfolded with a mix of solemnity and public spectacle. A crowd gathers in the town square, murmuring as the bell descends from its familiar perch. There's an air of judgment, not unlike the trial of a human criminal. Perhaps a priest leads the event, reciting chants or prayers as the bell is loaded onto a cart. People watch as it is hauled away, dragged to its exile or final destruction. For the townsfolk, this wasn't just about penalizing an object. It was a moment of communal catharsis, a way to physically remove a piece of the storm's legacy, and with it, the lingering fear of God's anger. Of course, it's tempting to dismiss all of this as ignorance. A bell didn't summon the wind, rain, and lightning. Everyone knows that now. But this wasn't about ignorance. It was about control, or at least the illusion of control. The medieval world was full of unpredictability, famine, war, disease, the churn of daily survival. These forces were often beyond human understanding or power. By finding something to blame, even an object like a bell, people could create a narrative for their suffering. Every punishment, no matter how peculiar, was a way to wrestle the chaos into something tangible, something that felt manageable. Storm trials also reveal just how blurred the boundaries were between what was sacred and what was mundane. Bells weren't just tools for calling people to prayer or signalling danger. They were loaded symbols of community and faith. When they rang, their sound carried spiritual meaning. It connected the heavens to the earth below. But that also meant they could attract divine scrutiny. In times of peace, a bell was a reliable ally, a protector of the town. In times of chaos, its role could shift into something much darker, marking it as a scapegoat for forces far beyond anyone's comprehension. What's fascinating is how consistently medieval justice applied this belief in universal accountability. A bell accused of summoning storms wasn't treated that differently from a sword accused of committing murder. In both cases, the object was put on trial, not because people genuinely believed it had thought or motive, but because it was tangled up in a moral and cosmic system that demanded resolution. Chaos couldn't simply be endured or ignored. It had to be accounted for, explained, and ultimately brought back into balance. And that balance wasn't just about satisfying the courts or community. It was about reassuring people that their world hadn't fallen apart entirely. Medieval life was built on the idea of order, hierarchies, rituals, laws, and customs. When something like a storm came crashing through, ripping roofs off houses and scattering livestock, it was more than just physical destruction. It was a rupture in the sense of stability that held society together. By blaming and punishing something like a bell, by performing justice in such a public way, medieval towns could tell themselves that the scales were, at least temporarily, set right again. The fear of chaos is something deeply human, even if we express it differently today. Think about how we respond to unexpected destruction, whether it's a natural disaster or an act of violence. We search for meaning. We look for someone or something to blame. And while we don't haul bells into courtrooms anymore, that instinct to restore order, to reclaim a sense of control over the uncontrollable, hasn't really gone away. Still, the idea of putting a bell on trial raises an obvious question. What about the people involved? Surely it wasn't just objects that medieval justice targeted in its quest for balance. What happened to the humans caught in the chaos? After all, if divine wrath was a punishment for sin, then surely somebody, flesh and blood, had to answer for it. And sometimes, as you'll see, justice demanded far more excruciating proof of a person's guilt or innocence than any object ever faced. Imagine you're standing barefoot on the cold stone floor of a dark medieval church. The air smells faintly of incense, but it does nothing to soothe the panic rising in your chest. A crowd has gathered around you, whispering prayers, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. In their midst, a priest blesses a long strip of glowing red metal, your fate now tied to the white-hot iron. At this moment, the questions you ask yourself are probably not about guilt or innocence. They're much simpler. How much will this hurt? And can I survive it? Welcome to the trial by ordeal, one of the most harrowing and illogical methods of medieval justice. At its simplest, this system boiled down to a single idea: let God decide. In the absence of modern evidence, investigations, or even rational reasoning, guilt and innocence were left to divine intervention. And while that may sound poetic or even fair in concept, in practice, it often meant enduring unbearable pain or facing a high likelihood of death to prove your integrity. No pressure. One of the most infamous variations was the ordeal of hot iron. Let's break it down. Here's how it worked. You, the accused, would be presented with a heated iron bar or rod, glowing with enough heat to make the air shimmer around it. The task was simple, or rather it was simple to explain. You would carry the burning iron for a specific distance, usually 9 paces. Sounds doable, right? Except doable doesn't account for the searing pain and permanent scarring that would follow. Afterward, your hand would be bandaged, not to soothe it, but to hide it. Because here's the kicker. The real judgment didn't happen during the ordeal itself. It came days later, when the bandages were removed and the wound was examined by officials. Now, the stakes of this inspection were almost absurdly cruel. If your burns began to heal cleanly, meaning no infection, swelling, or other signs of the body's natural reaction to being roasted alive, you were deemed innocent. You would walk away a free person, albeit with some unwanted souvenirs on your hand. But if the wound festered, if your body dared to do what bodies do and show signs of infection, well, guilty. And of course, the punishment for guilt wasn't something mild like a fine. It ranged from imprisonment to death. So short of being a medical miracle, your chances weren't exactly great. The logic behind this ordeal was as straightforward as it was terrifying. God would protect the innocent. The scorching iron wouldn't harm someone pure of heart because divine intervention would save them. It didn't seem to matter to anyone that human skin burns predictably and uniformly, no matter how virtuous you are. And while today we might look at trial by ordeal and recognize it as a cruel combination of pseudoscience and blind faith, to medieval people, it made perfect sense. It wasn't just about the pain. It was about trust. Trust that God watched closely and would intervene when it really mattered. If burning wasn't your thing, and let's be real, it wouldn't be, there was also the ordeal of cold water, another trial designed to test divine oversight. This one was arguably worse simply because of its horrifying simplicity. Picture this. You're tied up, probably with your hands bound to your ankles, and thrown into a body of water. Now, the theory here was that water, being a holy and pure element, would reject sinners. If you floated, the water had metaphorically cast you out, declaring you guilty. If you sank, the water had accepted you, and congratulations, you were innocent. Except, of course, sinking usually meant drowning. Think about the twisted logic for a moment. Sure, you prove your innocence, but only posthumously. And floating wasn't much better. Your life was spared, perhaps long enough to be dragged out of the water and sentenced for your clear guilt. No matter how you approached it, the trial of cold water created a horrifying no-win situation for the accused. Guilt or innocence didn't depend on facts, behavior, or evidence. It depended on the vague and unpredictable concept of divine favor, arbitrated by gods, priests, and, most unforgiving of all, physics. Here's what might add insult to injury. The rituals around these ordeals were deeply formalized, cloaked in a veil of religious dignity. Before the ordeal began, the accused would undergo days of preparation. This usually involved fasting, cleansing, attending church services, and offering prayers to purify the soul. The entire process was a spectacle, one that blurred the line between fear and faith for both the accused and the witnesses. Priests would bless the tools of the ordeal, the iron, the water, or even the ropes binding the accused, as if the act itself required divine legitimacy. To an outsider, it might look like theatre. To medieval minds, it was justice in its purest form. Sometimes the mere threat of an ordeal was enough to solicit a confession, knowing that they would have to submit to the pain of holding red-hot metal or risk being thrown into water. Many accused people opted to confess their crimes beforehand, whether they were guilty or not. In this way, the ordeal became less about determining guilt and more about breaking the spirit. After all, self-preservation is a powerful motivator. For someone standing on the brink of having their skin seared or lungs filled with water, admitting to a crime might have felt like the lesser evil. But if these tests led to predictable suffering and death, you might ask, why did people agree to them? In reality, they didn't always have a choice. Refusing to submit to an ordeal was tantamount to admitting guilt outright, and societal pressure was a force of its own. Denying the ordeal could brand you as an outcast, someone unwilling to submit to the higher powers of law and God. Accused individuals were often trapped between two equally impossible paths, facing the ordeal or accepting guilt and all the punishments it carried. These brutal tests weren't created out of malice, though. In the minds of medieval Europeans, they created order in a world that rarely felt predictable. Faith was a central pillar of their lives, and the belief in divine intervention justified the logic of ordeals. Why worry about evidence, witnesses, or shades of grey when God himself could weigh in, loud and clear, to confirm the truth? It didn't matter if it was objectively fair or rational. What mattered was that it gave people a sense of stability, however brutal it was to achieve. What's perhaps most striking about trial by ordeal is the deep faith people had in the process. These tests were incredibly harsh, almost guaranteeing harm, yet they were embraced as ultimate tools of justice. They reflected a distinctly medieval worldview, where earthly courts were merely an extension of a divine cosmic order. The laws of man didn't stand alone, they were tied to God, whose judgments were expected to intervene directly in human affairs. Whether it was hot iron or frigid water, the ordeal wasn't just a punishment or a test. It was a performance of faith, justice, and moral clarity. For all their flaws, and there were many, the trials by ordeal show how deeply intertwined religion, law, and community were in medieval life. Justice wasn't merely about determining guilt or innocence in an earthly sense. It was about maintaining the fragile balance of a moral and spiritual universe. The suffering someone endured wasn't a sign of human cruelty. To medieval minds, it was proof that the divine was watching, involved, and unwavering in its judgment. But if you think trial by ordeal sounds bad, imagine something even more direct, a legal system where disputes weren't settled with iron or water, but with swords, fists, and blood. Forget divine intervention. What if God's judgment came down to who was left standing? Medieval justice could be as straightforward and brutal as it was theatrical, and trial by combat was the ultimate stage. Imagine this. You're standing in a roped-off field just outside town, the kind of spot usually reserved for harvest festivals. Except today, there's no market, no music, and no merriment. Instead, the crowd has gathered for a fight, a legal fight. Across from you stands your opponent, your accuser, or maybe the one you've accused, armed and ready. Between you, there's no jury, no evidence to present, and no lawyer to argue your case. Everything will be decided in one way: blood, or at least until someone surrenders. Welcome to trial by combat, the medieval court where fists, swords, and brute force were the ultimate truth finders. Why would such a brutal and unpredictable system take root in medieval Europe? It all comes down to a simple and disturbingly effective belief system. People genuinely thought that God wouldn't let the righteous lose. If you entered the fight with a clear conscience and a just cause, divine intervention would tip the scales in your favour. The loser? Well, if they died, it was proof they were guilty. and if they could no longer stand, the shame of defeat was as good as a confession. No appeals, no second chances, just God, justice, and the battlefield. Trial by combat wasn't just for high-stakes treason cases or accusations of murder, though those were common enough. It could resolve disputes over land, debts, even insults, not exactly what you'd expect to end in a fight to the death. The process was surprisingly formalized. First, you'd start with an accusation, and once things escalated past any hope of negotiation, the court would approve the duel. The battlefield would be arranged, often in an open area where the entire community could watch because, of course, no medieval justice was complete without a crowd. The combatants would prepare their weapons, appropriate to their station, of course. Nobles might face off with swords and shields, while commoners were stuck with clubs, staffs, or whatever vaguely lethal object fit their rank. Even the rules for the fight were set in stone, strict boundaries, weapons agreed upon beforehand, and a referee of sorts to oversee the proceedings. The idea wasn't just about solving disputes, it was a performance of moral order. Imagine watching two neighbours argue over some farmland, and instead of sorting it out with contracts or arbitration, they take up weapons, shouting that God will prove whose side is right. The tension builds as they circle one another, trading blows, the crowd roaring with every hit. And at the end, when one of them collapses, either dead or begging for mercy, the winner stands tall, not just victorious but vindicated. People walked away from trials like these convinced that justice had been served, no matter how messy the process looked. But what if you couldn't fight? What if you were too old, too sick, or simply not skilled enough to wield a sword? Don't worry, the system had a loophole for that. Champions. If you couldn't stand in the field yourself, you were allowed to hire someone to do it for you. These weren't just volunteers from the local tavern looking to swing an axe for beer money. They were professionals, skilled fighters, who made a living by getting paid to take someone else's punches, or deliver a few fatal ones of their own. On paper, it sounds fair enough. You can't fight, so someone fights in your place. But in practice, it created a very obvious problem. Money. Champions didn't fight for free, and the best ones weren't cheap. For wealthy landowners, hiring a champion wasn't a big deal. They could secure the best warriors, tip the odds in their favour, and sit back knowing that their fate was in capable hands. For a poor farmer accused of theft, though, good luck scraping together enough coins to hire someone who even knew how to hold a sword. The system may have claimed to deliver divine justice, but your bank balance played a suspiciously large role in determining whether or not God seemed to favour you. The uneven playing field didn't stop there. Gender also factored heavily into trial by combat. Women, typically barred from fighting, could hire champions as well, but again, this depended on having the resources, and in some rare, brutal cases, women were allowed to fight, though the rules were rarely in their favour. In Germany, for instance, one recorded duel between a man and a woman involved eye-popping stipulations. The man had to fight with one arm tied behind his back, a fair handicap you might think, but the woman, she was confined to a waist-deep pit, unable to move freely, and armed only with whatever tool was deemed appropriate for her strength. If your idea of justice is a level playing field, this kind of spectacle hardly delivered. Then there were the exceptions to the rule, the strange cases that popped up when people outside the usual combatants decided they wanted their fights heard, or fought. Clergy members, normally protected from secular violence, occasionally demanded the right to trial by combat, much to the church's dismay. Picture a monk throwing down his prayer book and stepping into the ring because someone accused him of stealing monastery funds. It wasn't common, but it happened enough to make you wonder just how deeply this system's grip reached across society. For all its violence and spectacle, trial by combat wasn't chaotic. It followed rigid procedures, rooted in tradition and deeply held beliefs. There were strict rules about weapons, spaces, and even when a duel could end. Surrender was possible. Crying out for mercy meant you admitted defeat and guilt. But that wasn't exactly a popular move, since it often meant losing property, status, or worse. Besides, a surrender didn't guarantee survival. If your opponent was feeling me. The practice varied depending on where you were in Europe. Some regions embraced it with gusto, incorporating it into their legal systems as a practical method of resolving problems. Others approached it more cautiously, treating it like a last resort rather than a first option. Either way, it reflected a fragmented legal landscape where law wasn't always about fairness. Custom and local tradition often mattered more than universal principles, showing just how messy medieval justice could be. And yet, for all its brutality, there was a certain logic to trial by combat. It fit neatly into the worldview of the time where justice operated on both a human and divine level. Life was unpredictable, full of suffering and often unfair, but God's will was thought to be absolute. If an innocent man fell in combat, perhaps he wasn't as innocent as everyone thought. If a guilty one prevailed, maybe God saw something in his cause that mere humans had overlooked. Of course, that doesn't mean everyone believed in the system wholeheartedly. Even in medieval times, there were those who saw it for what it was: unfair, dangerous, and painfully arbitrary. One strong blow delivered to the weak, or one wealthy champion hired unfairly, could turn justice into a mockery. But for many, the spectacle and the belief in divine intervention outweighed those concerns. People needed reassurance that justice wasn't just theoretical, and there wasn't a more visceral way to deliver that than through a fight to the death. These duels weren't just about settling disputes, they were about maintaining public faith in the laws that held society together. Watching a fight unfold, seeing the blood spilled and hearing the final cries of the defeated, all of it reminded onlookers of the power of justice, or at least its performance. That's what trial by combat was, a performance of order and morality, however brutal it may have been. But let's not forget the people who stood in the margins of these battles. The spectators may have cheered, but someone had to enforce the grim decisions that followed. Someone had to execute the sentences, deal with the bodies, and carry out the law's ugliest tasks. And in that role, the executioner lived on the very edge of society, vital to the system, but forever stained by its cruelty. What kind of life awaited those who carried the ultimate burden of justice? Let's take a closer look at the people behind the axe. So, you've been handed the job of the executioner. Let's assume you didn't exactly sign up for it. Maybe you inherited the role. It was common for executioner families to pass the title down like a walked heirloom. Or maybe the town sort of nudged you into it because nobody else wanted to swing the axe. Congratulations. You're now officially part of the justice system. But here's the catch. While you're deemed essential to upholding the law, society itself will make sure you never forget how tainted your position really is. Executioners occupied one of the most paradoxical roles in medieval Europe. They were indispensable. You couldn't have public justice without them. But they were also deeply feared, ostracized, and sometimes outright hated. These weren't people welcomed at town feasts or church services. Their work, by its very nature, was seen as corrupting, shedding blood, handling death. It marked them spiritually and morally, like they carried the weight of every execution on their skin. To medieval minds, it was impossible to come into such close contact with death and not end up contaminated by it. And so, society decided to keep its distance. If you were an executioner, the first thing you probably noticed was the physical separation. Literal distance was required. Many executioners were forced to live outside town walls, as if even their presence could poison daily life. You weren't barred from entering the town entirely. How else would you do your job? But strict limitations were placed on when and how you could interact with others. Maybe you were allowed to venture in only on market days, and even then there were rules. Touching food? Prohibited. The belief was that your hands, so often associated with death, could taint anything you might pick up. Imagine walking through a bustling market with coins in your pocket, but no way to actually buy bread without someone wrinkling their nose and stepping aside. It's not exactly a life of warm welcomes. This isolation wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic. The entire community needed an executioner. They needed someone to enforce the ultimate judgments of the law, but no one wanted to admit what that actually required. By living outside the walls, you served as a walking reminder that justice came at a cost. People wanted the order you provided, but they didn't want the visible stains of what you represented lingering near their homes. Out of sight, out of mind, or at least, that was the hope. Of course, this level of separation extended beyond the physical. Socially, executioners were pariahs. Invites to weddings? Forget it. A seat at the church altar? Not happening. In fact, your role was considered so spiritually unclean that you were often barred from participating in religious sacraments. The idea was straightforward, if brutal. Someone who spends their days taking life had no business brushing elbows with the sacred. communion, confession, even burial in consecrated ground, executioners were often denied these rituals outright. Picture this. Someone avoids you all year, spits in your direction when they see you in the market. Then, one day, their horse breaks a leg, or their child develops an infection no one else can cure. Like it or not, they turn to you, the executioner, for help. And you help. Maybe you even save a life, using the same hands that ended others. It's a strange duality, isn't it? The same person who carried out public hangings in the morning might be stitching up someone's wounds by afternoon. People depended on you, but only in their most desperate moments. Otherwise, you were someone they whispered about, avoided, or outright shunned. Even the tools of your trade carried their own stigma. Executioners' swords, axes, and ropes weren't just tools. They were feared objects in their own right. These items were often stored separately, treated as if they themselves were infectiously unclean. Some tools were subject to rituals, like blessings or consecrations, before they were used, and sometimes afterward, as if to purify them of the terrible acts they'd performed. This fear of contamination wasn't limited to what the tools touched. It extended to anyone who handled them, ensuring that the executioner's role continued to be one of isolation. In many ways, the harsh treatment of executioners reflected a broader contradiction in medieval justice. The people who carried out the law's most brutal demands were seen as vital to maintaining order. Yet, the very nature of their work separated them from the communities they served. It was as though society needed them but couldn't fully accept what they represented. A stark reminder of the violence and death that lay behind the comforting illusion of justice. This paradox hints at something even deeper, something that went beyond executions. Death, particularly violent death, carried with it a spiritual weight that medieval society wasn't equipped to deal with rationally. The executioner was the person who had to bear that weight, shouldering the guilt, fear, and moral unease of an entire town. By ostracizing them, the community could feel cleansed, as if the burden of justice had been safely pushed away. In the end, the lonely life of the executioner wasn't just about one person's social standing or spiritual purity. It revealed something fundamental about how people coped with their own fear of moral contamination. The executioner became a scapegoat, much like the objects and animals that had been put on trial before them. Society needed them, but only from a distance. And if that distance reinforced the fragile illusion of order and purity, then so be it. But the executioner wasn't the only one carrying this burden. Medieval justice had a way of making everyone complicit in its grim performances. Communities didn't just witness punishments, they actively participated. And nowhere was this clearer than in the public spectacle of shame, where the line between ridicule and justice blurred completely. Picture this. You're walking through a bustling medieval marketplace, the kind of place where the air smells faintly of bread, sweat, and a hint of manure. Bakers shout out prices for their loaves, merchants haggle over bolts of fabric. But then you spot someone who isn't yelling or selling. Sitting in the middle of the square is a man, completely naked, his head low as people pass by. Every now and then, a villager sneers or tosses a few coins at his feet. He doesn't look up, though. He's too focused on the humiliating chant he's been ordered to repeat aloud. Something like, "I am a debtor and cannot pay what is owed." A public spectacle of shame, right here alongside the bartering and gossip. And it's not even lunchtime yet. Public humiliation wasn't just another form of punishment in medieval Europe. It was an entire system designed to correct behaviour, restore order, and engage every person who happened to pass by. At its core, shame was considered a powerful tool, maybe even more effective than locking someone away or issuing a fine. Because the embarrassment didn't just punish the offender, it put their failure on display for the entire community. The message was loud and clear: do better, or you could be next. Take that man in the town square, for example. Debtors in France who couldn't repay what they owed might end up right where he was, stripped of their dignity as much as their clothes. It wasn't just about making an example of them. The idea was surprisingly practical, in a warped way. As they sat there exposed, villagers might feel inclined to toss a coin or two, contributing toward the debt being paid off. It was a mix of charity and public chastisement, helping someone while also taking a moment to spit on their pride. Humanity at its most contradictory. But debtors weren't the only ones in the line of public shame fire. Bakers, for instance, had their own special brand of punishment, and it was about as poetic as medieval justice could get. Imagine this. You're a baker, and times are tough. Wheat prices have gone up and you're cutting corners, selling loaves that don't quite weigh as much as they should. One day, a town official checks your bread, discovers your scam, and before you know it, you're the centerpiece of a parade you never wanted to join. A sturdy rope dangles your underweight bread around your neck as you're marched through the streets. People jeer, maybe someone pelts you with an onion. Everyone knows your crime now, and more importantly, they know its cost. Why bread? Why make someone walk around wearing something they baked poorly? It's simple. The punishment mirrored the crime. If you cheated your customers by selling lightweight bread, the bread itself became part of your downfall. The act of physically displaying it made the crime impossible to separate from the criminal. This kind of punishment wasn't just about shaming the baker, it was about protecting the public. It sent a message to everyone else in the market. We're watching. Don't try to cheat. And bakers weren't the only ones subjected to these poetic punishments. Brewers, caught watering down their ale, faced their own sudsy form of justice. Instead of parading bad ale around the square, they were forced to drink it, publicly. Picture it. A man sits on a stool, gagging on the very product he tried to sell, as the crowd watches, with a mix of delight and disgust. You can almost hear the smirking commentary from the villagers. How do you like your own handiwork, eh? These strange, sometimes theatrical punishments worked because they relied on one critical factor: community participation. The punishment wasn't locked away in a cell where no one could see. It was public, loud, and deeply embarrassing. It needed the crowd, their laughter, their judgmental stares, their murmurs of disapproval. Without the villagers standing there to bear witness, the punishment wouldn't carry the same weight. A loaf of bread around your neck means nothing if no one's around to mock you for it. Public shame fed on collective involvement. You might walk away humiliated, but every face in the crowd was a reminder that your reputation had just been dragged through the mud. Shame, for all its cruelty, wasn't just a medieval pastime. It was functional. It served a purpose. In a world that relied heavily on tight-knit community bonds, public disgrace could be a powerful way to keep people in line. If you risked shaming yourself, your family, and maybe even your livelihood, you'd think twice before cutting corners on those loaves of bread or dodging your debts. And because communities were so interconnected, avoiding that shame wasn't an option. Everyone already knew everyone else's business, so humiliation didn't just punish the individual, it sent shockwaves through their entire social circle. What made these punishments especially effective, or insidious depending on how you look at it, was the belief that shame could correct moral behaviour. A debt unpaid, bread underweight, ale watered down, these things disrupted the moral and economic balance of the community. Punishing offenders wasn't just about making them suffer, it was about resetting the scales. You were humiliated, not as a random act of cruelty, but as a way to restore the larger sense of social order. And in a way, everyone played a part. The crowd didn't just watch. They reinforced the lesson by participating in the spectacle. Their mockery kept the offender in their place, reminding them where they went wrong. Of course, there was a darker side to it all. The same public that enforced shame could also take it too far. Crowds weren't always reasonable arbiters of justice. They could become malicious, spitting venom at the accused, throwing rotten food, or escalating punishments into chaos. Humiliation has a way of snowballing, especially when people feel emboldened by a mob. And for the person at the centre of it all, there wasn't much recourse. Once you'd been marked by a punishment like that, your reputation wasn't so easily restored. People might forgive, in theory, but those memories of you dragging underweight bread around your neck, those didn't fade quickly. Still, it wasn't just about spectacle for spectacle's sake. Even these ridiculous punishments reflected broader values about fairness and morality. They showed what medieval society cared about: honest trade, debt repayment, community integrity. and they made one thing clear. Justice in the medieval world wasn't a private affair. It was public, communal, and designed to send a message. Watching someone else's shame was supposed to make you double-check your own behaviour. Were your loaves properly weighed? Were your debts paid? Did you keep your dealings honest? The threat of becoming next week's public display was enough to keep most people in line. There's something undeniably fascinating and uncomfortable about how intertwined justice and entertainment were. Each punishment was carefully tailored to the crime, designed to make it memorable. There wasn't anything detached or clinical about medieval justice. It wasn't about paperwork or distant sentencing chambers. It happened right where everyone could see, and it invited everyone to participate, for better or worse. But here's the question. Could a system like this work today? Would public shame, parading someone around town with their offence literally hanging off their shoulders, be effective in a world that's far more fractured and anonymous? Or has shame simply migrated to new, less tangible forms, maybe through internet comment sections and viral videos? Either way, something about the public nature of medieval punishments feels strangely familiar. The tools are different, sure, but the impulse to make wrongdoing visible, to let the crowd weigh in, is still very much alive. What makes these practices stand out, though, is how deeply embedded they were in both the moral and practical framework of medieval life. Justice wasn't just about the letter of the law, it was about the fabric of society, the relationships between neighbours, the trust in the marketplace. And that trust, once broken, was painfully hard to repair. Public shame wasn't just a punishment, it was a spectacle meant to reset the fragile ecosystem of medieval relationships, even if it permanently marked the person whose reputation took the hit. But if you think the marketplace was the only place where medieval laws reigned supreme, think again. The rules stretched far beyond bread and beer, into every corner of life, governing not just business but inheritance, family ties, and even who deserved what in the afterlife. When it came to medieval law, no part of life was too small for a decree. You're at the market on a crisp morning, coins jingling in your hand, looking for a decent loaf of bread. Vendors shout prices, customers inspect goods, but there's something strange today. A commotion coming down the street. It's a man, a baker, and he doesn't look happy. Around his neck hang several loaves of bread, tied with sturdy rope, each one a little too small, a little too light. He's not hawking wares. He's not heading home. He's being paraded through the marketplace on a very specific walk of shame, surrounded by jeering townsfolk who all know what he's done. Somewhere along the way, someone shouts, "Underweight again, eh?" And the whole crowd roars with laughter. It's not just bread on display, it's his guilt. This wasn't just a bad day for a less than honest baker. This was justice in action for medieval Europe. Markets were tightly controlled spaces, the beating hearts of towns and villages, where everything from grain to fabric exchanged hands. The prices were fixed, the weights were set, and the rules? They weren't suggestions. Anyone caught skimming on quality or cheating on quantity would face swift and often creative consequences. For bakers, the punishment fit the crime almost too perfectly. Sell bread that's underweight, and suddenly those loaves became your necklace, your badge of public humiliation. This kind of justice wasn't subtle, but it was effective. It wasn't meant to ruin someone's life forever. The goal was to turn the offender into a warning, a living lesson for the rest of the market. If you were a brewer who watered down ale, the punishment was just as poetic. You'd be made to drink it yourself, cup after cup, in front of everyone who had already paid good money, to avoid exactly that kind of watery swill. The villagers wouldn't just judge you, they'd laugh, make jokes about your brewing skills, and then take that story home to share over dinner. By the next morning, your reputation as a merchant would be circling the drain, along with your profits. But let's pause for a moment. Why the fuss over bread and ale? Today we might think of food regulation as important, but not exactly life or death. Back then, though, it was both. Bread especially wasn't just food, it was survival. A poorly made loaf or a dishonest bakery didn't just cost you a couple of coins. It threatened the delicate balance of a community that lived far too close to starvation. And ale wasn't just beer, It was cleaner than most water sources, making it a daily necessity for many households. So yes, when a baker or brewer cheated, they weren't just being selfish, they were putting the entire market's trust in jeopardy, and with it, the stability that kept everyone fed and alive. For that reason, punishments had to be not only severe but unforgettable. Then there was the public part of it all. These punishments weren't carried out behind closed doors. A market wasn't just about trade. It was a social hotspot, where neighbours caught up on gossip, traders bragged about their deals, and the community kept a close eye on what everyone else was doing. Punishment by humiliation only worked because it unfolded in front of the same people who counted on that market for their daily bread. The connection between reputation and business was direct. A merchant who got embarrassed in the marketplace didn't just lose face, they lost customers. And in a medieval economy that relied heavily on trust and familiarity, a bad reputation could close up shop faster than a bad crop. But it wasn't only bakers and brewers who were singled out. Almost every stall in the market had its own rules and standards, and failure to meet them could drag even the most respectable merchant into trouble. If a butcher sold spoiled meat, it might earn him a few unwanted hours sitting next to that same meat, displayed for everyone to see. Fishermen caught selling rotten fish might find their catch strapped to their body as they paraded through town smelling, well, exactly how you'd expect. The offences and their consequences were tightly paired, creating a system so specific it's hard not to wonder if medieval judges had a darkly comedic streak. Take a moment to think about what this kind of justice says about medieval values. It wasn't just punitive, it was restorative. These punishments didn't throw merchants into dungeons or impose heavy fines that could wipe out a livelihood. Instead, they were designed to return the wrongdoer to the community, to realign them with the expectations of their peers. You weren't punished in isolation, you were punished in front of your customers, neighbours, and rivals, the very people whose trust and approval you needed to rebuild. The idea wasn't to cut you off from society, but to recalibrate your place within it. And there was a moral aspect to it too. For medieval towns, markets weren't just centres of commerce, they were reflections of the community's moral order. Fair trade wasn't just about money changing hands. It was about maintaining balance in a world deeply dependent on trust and cooperation. A dishonest merchant didn't just cheat his customers, he threatened the harmony of the community, the fragile sense that everyone was playing by the same rules in a world where resources were often scarce. So yes, tying bread to someone's neck or making them drink bad ale wasn't just punishment, it was a way of repairing invisible fractures in the social fabric.
But let's not romanticize it too much. These punishments could be harsh, even ruinous, especially for those without the resources to recover quickly. A small-time baker trying to scrape by might find his reputation permanently damaged for a mistake that a wealthier merchant could smooth over with a few coins or political connections. Like many systems of justice, it wasn't always fair, no matter how much it aimed to create fairness. And the public nature of these shaming rituals meant that whatever damage was done wasn't easily erased. People gossiping about your failure last week would likely still whisper about it months or years later. Still, the necessity of rules and consequences in the market speaks volumes about medieval priorities. These weren't laws dreamed up by bored officials looking for something to enforce. They were practical, born out of real concerns about survival, trust, and fairness. If bread ran light or ale ran thin, it didn't just irritate a handful of customers, it endangered the community's ability to rely on its systems of trade. And in a world where famines were frequent and competition for resources was deadly serious, that kind of instability could quickly spiral into chaos. It's easy to imagine the medieval market as chaotic and freewheeling, but these regulations prove otherwise. It was a world governed by rules, both spoken and unspoken, and those who stepped out of line did so at their peril. Justice wasn't subtle, but it also wasn't arbitrary. It was precise, almost poetic, and deeply rooted in the daily lives of the people it governed. Even while it humiliated its offenders, it clarified the standards everyone was expected to uphold, creating a sense of order that went far beyond the marketplace. And let's not ignore the sheer theatricality of it all. While modern courts operate mostly out of sight, medieval justice thrived in the public eye.
There was no curtain, no privacy, and no hiding from judgment. Every punishment was a performance, part warning, part entertainment, part moral lesson. Whether it was bread, ale, meat, or fish, the offence and the punishment came together to create a narrative everyone in the market could remember. Merchants thought twice before disregarding the lessons baked, literally, into these rituals of shame.
At its core, the system reveals how interconnected medieval life truly was. Laws weren't abstract theories. They were practical tools to keep the whole community running smoothly. Every rule about bread weights or ale quality wasn't just about economics. It was about survival, trust, and maintaining the delicate balance that allowed a village or town to function as one. Violations of this trust weren't just personal failings. They were cracks in the foundation of an entire society, and punishment served the dual purpose of repairing those cracks and reminding everyone that fairness wasn't optional, it was required. So while it's easy to laugh at the image of a baker shamefully trudging through town with loaves swinging around his neck, there's something strangely effective about the system he was caught up in. Justice was immediate, direct, and deeply tied to the community it aimed to protect. Everyone was part of the process, whether they cheered from the sidelines or whispered warnings to the next generation of merchants. For better or worse, medieval markets were places where moral lessons were learned in real time, with very real consequences. The question is, how far has that idea really gone? Modern courtrooms may be quieter, punishments less theatrical, and rules handled behind the scenes, but the weight of transparency and accountability lingers. Maybe we aren't parading bakers through the streets anymore, but the desire to tie offences to clear consequences hasn't disappeared. Even today, people want to see justice, and they want it to fit the crime in just the right way. The tools may have changed, but the principle? It remains remarkably familiar. Medieval justice wasn't built to be fair. It was built to hold the world together. Every trial, every punishment, was a desperate attempt to maintain a fragile web of moral and cosmic order. A pig could face an executioner, a bell could be blamed for storms, and a baker with light loaves could be shamed into honesty. Their laws weren't concerned with individual fairness. They were obsessed with balance, with survival. But here's the question: centuries from now, will our justice system seem just as bizarre? Maybe fairness itself is just a shifting concept. One day history might laugh at us too,